Over the course of my channel, I've covered most of the escort carriers of Taffy 3. White Plains, Kitcon Bay, St. Lo, and, of course, Gambier Bay. With the exception of the most recent one, Kitcon Bay, those were the famous names of that battle. However, there are still two that I haven't touched on yet. Fanshawe Bay was one. The other was Kalinin Bay, the topic of today's video. One that I'll admit would probably have been more fitting a couple weeks ago. Nonetheless, here we are today. Kalinin Bay is, in common with her sisters, a survivor. This ship would suffer multiple heavy shell hits, as well as kamikaze strikes. And yet, despite this, she would survive and continue on, with very few losses in the crew on top of that. Which is, I grant you, the most important thing for any ship, keeping the crew alive. And in this, Kalinin Bay was a resounding success, even if Samar did prove to be her swan song in regard to combat service. Because, as is often the case with these escort carriers, that service began fairly late. For Kalinin Bay in particular, that story started on April 26th of 1943. One of the many escort carriers laid down by the Kaiser shipyard in Vancouver, Washington, with the ship launched on October 15th, 1943, as one of the 50-strong Casablanca class, something she has in common with the others at Samar, so I won't go into major detail on the design. We'll just do the simple version. Kalinin Bay displaced around 11,000 tons when fully loaded, on a hull of 512 feet, 3 inches, 156 meters in length, with a beam of 108 feet, 33 meters, while the flight deck for its part was 474 feet, 144 meters long. Of course, not the largest carrier out there, but that was the point of these escort carriers. Relatively small, cheap, and most importantly, quick to build. You can see more of this cheapness reflected in the speed. That was only 19 knots on 9,000 shaft horsepower. Escort carriers would often be used as aircraft ferries. There was no need to be fast in that role. The same could be said for operating as convoy escorts, where the merchants were often slower. Still, slow or not, Kalinin Bay remained an effective combat warship, capable of operating between 25 to 30 aircraft, depending on the exact loadout. Those planes were both the offensive and defensive punch of the ship, because those small carriers only had a single 5-inch gun for self-defense, alongside a maximum of 16 40mm Bofors and up to 30 20mm cannon. And with that important note for later, we come to the end of the design. Like I said, I wasn't going to linger long today. Instead, let's move on to what Kalinin Bay did with those design features. With this part of the story starting on November 27th, 1943, when Kalinin Bay was commissioned. Yes, this ship went from her keel laying in April to entering service at the end of November. Say what you want about Kaiser or the escort carriers in general, but when it came to the goal of build them cheap and build them fast, that was a success by all metrics. Though, as is typical, there was still a bit of training and working up before Kalinin Bay formally entered service. Her shakedown cruise, for example, didn't kick off until December 18th, 1943, with the ship only sailing for Hawaii in early January 1944. In this case, to drop off a group of Marine aviators on January 9th. That would be her first transport run, but by no definition the last, because after dropping those men off, Kalinin Bay picked up more Marines, with those men and aircraft destined for the island of Tarawa. This had only recently been secured from Japanese control in one of the most famously bloody battles of the entire Pacific War. A battle that Kalinin Bay wasn't involved in, of course. She would only transport the Corsairs for Tarawa's airstrip, with those flown off on January 24th, 1944. Once this was done, the escort carrier shifted to further transport duty. From the end of January through the end of April, that would be her primary duty, with Kalinin Bay in particular transferring aircraft as replacements to the big fleet carriers, including, interestingly, Enterprise herself in early February. All well and good, of course, but not the most gripping of stories. This was the kind of quiet and underappreciated work that underpinned the entire war effort. KB, as her crew called her, was doing good work. It just wasn't headline grabbing. Not in resupplying the fleet carriers, nor in a trip to Hawaii in February. And from there on to San Diego. Though there is one interesting note in the second trip. When she reached San Diego, Kalinin Bay would pick up no fewer than 49 aircraft to transport to the front, none of which she could actually operate. It was 9 Hellcats and 40 Curtiss Helldivers. A ship like Kalinin Bay would, for her organic air group, operate FM Wildcats and TBM Avengers. When it came to transport runs, these ships could carry just about anything. There's some pretty interesting pictures of escort carrier decks crammed with a wild variety of planes, including PBY Catalinas, which barely fit. But I digress. Those Hellcats and Helldivers would be dropped off at Pearl Harbor on April 15th, 1944, where she would pick up her own aircraft once more to sail for anti-submarine patrol duty in the Marshall Islands, in particular off Mille Atoll. Not much would happen from April 25th to May 1st of 1944. Japanese submarines seemed to have avoided the area. As a result, Kalinin Bay was sent back to Hawaii to prepare for a much more exciting operation, the invasion of the Marianas. Over the course of May 1944, the ship and her crew trained rigorously, something that saw her join up with some interesting names in Task Group 52.15, specifically Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, and Midway, with the last one better known under the name she sank with, USS St. Lo, meaning, of course, that you have 4 of the 6 Taffy 3 carriers in this group, the missing pair being Gambier Bay and Kitkun Bay. Most of this group would set sail together on May 30th, 1944. Midway was shifted to a different formation, leaving Fanshawe Bay, Kalinin Bay, and White Plains to continue on, with some excitement coming almost the moment they left Hawaii. On June 1st, a Japanese submarine, ironically enough, attempted to torpedo Kalinin Bay, 2 torpedoes came dangerously close to the carrier's bow, one within 75 yards of port and one within 50 yards of starboard, 68 and 45 meters respectively. By the time those were sighted, it was too late to make any evasive action. However, as the crew braced for impact, both torpedoes would miss. They swam on either side of the carrier before vanishing off starboard. As for the Japanese submarine, it was never detected. That near disaster aside, Kalinin Bay had an uneventful voyage. She arrived at Eniwetok on June 9th for a short rest period, before promptly departing on June 11th as part of the support group for the invasion of Saipan. That was scheduled for June 15th. On the 14th, there would be another scare when a Japanese G4M Betty attacked the ship. Kalinin Bay was defended by her pilots, who downed the enemy attacker. With that done, the ship set up shop off Saipan, where the invasion kicked off on the 15th as scheduled. The Japanese, for their part, were quick to respond. Air attacks began as early as the 15th, though the first major counterattack came on the 17th of June. Kalinin Bay would lose 2 Wildcats during that fighting, though she and her pilots came out pretty well. The same couldn't be said for the overall American formation, which needed replacement aircraft. Kalinin Bay would, as a result, transfer most of her aircraft to other ships. All well and good, but that meant the ship was down to just 3 Wildcats. As such, Kalinin Bay would have to sail to Eniwetok for replacements. This would keep her out of the area during the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th and 20th. In fact, the escort carrier only returned to action on June 24th, by which point the worst of the Japanese attacks were over. Not all of them. Another submarine scare came on June 28th, but most of them. Kalinin Bay would, in light of this, shift to full support duty, be it operating as a fighter carrier to watch for Japanese attackers, or sending planes towards Saipan, where they would attack Japanese positions on the island, something that would continue through July 9th, during which another G4M attacked Kalinin Bay on July 2nd. This failed to land a hit, and the bomber was promptly shot down. As for the escort carrier, she would depart on July 9th, though she wouldn't be going far. Instead of sailing for home, Kalinin Bay shifted to Guam, where she would support the liberation of that far-flung American possession for the rest of the month. Because of this, it was only in early August 1944 that Kalinin Bay left the Marianas. She sailed on to Eniwetok once more on August 2nd, where the carrier would remain until August 18th to resupply and give her tired crew some much-needed shore leave. This was especially important because Kalinin Bay would soon be assigned to another support role, the operations in the Palau Islands, to be specific, the most famous of which was, of course, Peleliu. To support those operations, Kalinin Bay set up near the Palaus on September 14th, for, as it would turn out, 2 weeks of near-constant fighting. From September 15th to the 25th, Kalinin Bay's pilots would take off every day. Around 400 sorties, ranging from reconnaissance to bombing and strafing. An unsung kind of duty, but one that Marines on Peleliu definitely appreciated. That said, on the 25th, the escort carrier would depart to prepare for another amphibious operation in the liberation of the Philippines. It was here that Kalinin Bay was assigned to Task Unit 77.4.3, codenamed Taffy 3. Though she started out the operation in a different group, it was only on the 20th of October that she joined Taffy 3 proper. In this operation, the carrier supported the landings on Leyte on October 17, 1944, with Kalinin Bay's aircraft flying 244 sorties between the 18th and 24th of October. This was the quiet before the storm, as it would turn out, because on the 25th, the Battle of Samar would begin, when an Avenger piloted by Ensign Bill Brooks spotted the Japanese center force. This plane and pilot was from St. Lo, making her the first to sight the Japanese formation, with this coming around 6:50 in the morning. Soon enough, the Japanese went into visual range. This group had been depleted by submarine and air attack, but remained a very deadly formation, centered on Yamato herself, along with Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna. That formation soon began to open fire on the escort carriers of Taffy 3. In response, the carriers turned away and made their best speed away from the Japanese. As this was only around 19 knots, they could never hope to escape. Still, they tried while sending every available aircraft to the sky, soon to be joined by aircraft from the other Taffy groups, which would spend the entire battle harassing the Japanese, doing some notable damage of their own. As for Kalinin Bay, she began the battle at the head of the American formation, during the run to the east from 6:50 a.m. to around 7:23, when the carriers turned southwest. This would require a shuffling of the formation, one that saw Kalinin Bay become the trailing carrier, and one of the main targets of Japanese fire. Tail End Charlie, as her crew called it. As the carrier was subjected to intense fire, her pilots drove home their attack, flinging everything they had, from small bombs to rockets and machine gun fire, at the Japanese fleet. Those pilots would claim hits on several Japanese warships, while their own ship suffered her first hit around 7:50, a battleship caliber shell that exploded near the starboard side. This shell, most likely from Haruna, broke up on impact with the water. However, a large chunk continued on, cutting through Kalinin Bay's side about 6 feet above the hangar, where it promptly embedded itself on the other side of the ship. More damaging hits would come from heavy cruisers. Those had closed in to around 18,000 yards by 8 p.m., close enough that, even as straddles surrounded the carrier, Kalinin Bay could return fire. Her single stern-mounted 5-inch gun blasted away, even when 3 8-inch shells hit the ship within minutes of each other, 2 to the stern and 1 to the bow. 2 more near misses caused dangerous flooding to the stern, though they didn't slow the ship down. Nonetheless, the 5-inch gun crew continued to fire back. They reported hitting a Nachi-class cruiser, direct quote, "I know it's the Miyoko class," around 8:25, specifically the cruiser's second turret. A second hit to the same area created enough flames to obscure the turret and drive that cruiser off as well. That ship could only have been Haguro, as the only ship of her class present, which would mean the shells did little damage, but bomb hits in the same period did damage the turret. Soon enough, the cruiser would be replaced by a group of 5 Japanese destroyers. Those came into view on the starboard side around 8:30. Initially confused for friendly ships, this was proven false when they opened fire around 14,500 yards from Kalinin Bay. The stern 5-inch gun naturally swapped to trading fire with those destroyers, with this running gun battle seeing no notable damage on either side, though some torpedoes would come dangerously close, with an Avenger detonating at least one by gunfire, while another was reportedly deflected by fire from Kalinin Bay's 5-inch gun. Nonetheless, the worst was yet to come, with Haguro and Tone returning to the fray around 8:45. They began to catch up with the battered escort carrier, directing deadly fire towards Kalinin Bay. 2 shells, hits 4 and 5, struck on the port side, before punching clean through the thin-skinned ship. Hit 6 would be the most dangerous of the bunch. This punched through the ship before exploding in the port aviation lube oil tank. Fuel lines were punctured, while the bulkhead to the forward engine room was ruptured in 10 places. This caused severe flooding, reaching up to 4 feet of water in the engine room. That could have been a disaster, but the crew managed to control the flooding and keep their ship going. That shell would also come very close to punching clean through the bottom of the ship. From here on, several more shells would hit. Number 7 punched through the ship, while hit 8 wrecked the ship's armory, before puncturing more fuel tanks. Fires from this hit would rage for an hour and a half. Hit 9 did relatively little damage by comparison, as it shot through the carrier, while the 10th hit punched through the flight deck, as would number 11, though this shell also wrecked the forward elevator. Hit 12, for its part, damaged the radar room, while hits 13 and 14 caused further damage to the flight deck and the funnel uptakes. And the final shell, number 15, did yet more damage to the flight deck and those already damaged uptakes. All of those hits eventually caused a starboard list that was quickly corrected by counter-flooding. The carrier continued on as the Japanese broke off around 9:30. Kalinin Bay had survived with some of the worst damage of any American survivor that day. However, she wasn't quite out of danger yet. An hour later, around 10:50, Japanese kamikazes appeared. 1-0 dove on Kalinin Bay, crashing into the flight deck. Fortunately, that plane only caused a large hole and fire. No explosion. A second 0 would then careen off the port side before slamming into the water, with a third also crashing off the port side. With this, the attacks concluded. Kalinin Bay was battered from stem to stern, but remained stubbornly afloat, and miraculously only lost 9 of the crew, 5 aboard the ship and 4 in the aircraft, with a further 60 wounded. However, the ship was out of the active part of the war. Kalinin Bay would eventually reach California on November 27, 1944, with the ship finishing her repairs by January 18, 1945. She would then spend the rest of the war bouncing between safe harbors to conduct more transport runs, ultimately rounding off her service with Operation Magic Carpet to bring men home. during which, on December 25th, she suffered severe damage from a storm on her way to Japan, with the veteran escort carrier finally decommissioned on May 15th, 1946, and scrapped on December 8th. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one. Also, apologies for how rough my voice is. I think I'm probably coming down with something.